Manipulation doesn't only happen to weak people, it happens to smart people, capable people, even disciplined people. In fact, the more responsible you are, the more likely someone will try to use that against you. Because manipulation doesn't rely on intelligence, it relies on leverage. And leverage is almost always emotional. Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious, dramatic lies, exaggerated stories, clear deception. But real manipulation is quieter. It shows up as urgency, as guilt, as flattery, as subtle pressure, as someone making you feel responsible for emotions that are not yours to carry. It doesn't feel like force. It feels like obligation. And obligation is powerful. Think about how many decisions you've made not because they aligned with your values, but because you didn't want to disappoint someone, or because the timing felt urgent, or because you didn't want to appear selfish, or because you didn't want to seem difficult. That is leverage. Manipulation works by finding the emotional button that moves you fastest. For some people, it's fear. For others, it's the need to be liked. For others, it's the discomfort of conflict. For others, it's the desire to fix and rescue. When someone discovers that button, even unintentionally, they can influence your decisions without ever raising their voice. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Manipulation continues when it produces results. If guilt gets you to say yes, guilt will be used again. If urgency overrides your boundaries, urgency will appear more often. If flattery lowers your guard, flattery will increase. People repeat what works. Most content online teaches you how to spot manipulators. That's useful but incomplete. Because even if you identify manipulation, if your internal structure is unstable, you will still feel the pressure. You will still feel the pull. The real defense is not external detection. It is internal discipline. The Stoics understood something. Modern psychology continues to confirm no one can control your decisions without first influencing your emotional state. If they can create guilt, they can rush you. If they can create fear, they can steer you. If they can create validation, they can anchor you. Emotional movement precedes behavioral movement. So the goal of this video is not to make you suspicious of everyone. It's to make you stable, because stability removes leverage. When your emotions are governed, urgency loses power. When your approval seeking is reduced, flattery loses power. When your fear is managed, threats lose power. Over the next several segments, I'm going to walk you through 5 silent habits that make you extremely difficult to manipulate. Not aggressive, not cold, just steady. These are structural adjustments, internal disciplines, and when you apply them consistently, something changes. You don't feel rushed, you don't feel pulled, you don't feel cornered into decisions you later regret. Manipulation only works when there's an opening. We're going to close those openings, quietly, deliberately, and permanently. Before we get into the first habit, you need the foundation. Because if you don't understand this principle, you'll try to fight manipulation externally instead of neutralizing it internally. And external fighting almost always creates more tension than clarity. The Stoic foundation is simple: separate what you control from what you don't. You do not control someone else's tactics. You do not control whether someone attempts to guilt you, flatter you, pressure you, or distort a situation. You control your response. You control your timing. You control your decision-making process. And most importantly, you control whether emotion dictates your action. Manipulation works by collapsing space. It compresses the distance between stimulus and decision. I need an answer right now. If you cared, you would. Everyone else already agreed. You're the only one I can count on. These phrases aren't forceful, they're strategic. They create emotional acceleration. And when emotion accelerates, reasoning narrows. The Stoics trained themselves to widen that space deliberately. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself not to be carried away by impressions. An impression is the first emotional interpretation of a situation. It feels urgent, it feels true, but it is not yet examined. If you act from impressions alone, you are reactive, and reactive people are influenceable. Think about it this way: if someone can predict your emotional pattern, They can predict your decisions. If they know guilt makes you comply, they will lean into guilt. If they know you avoid conflict, they will escalate tension. If they know you crave approval, they will offer it selectively. Emotional predictability creates behavioral predictability, and behavioral predictability creates leverage. This is why self-governance is not just a personal virtue, it is a defensive strategy. When you slow down emotionally, you disrupt the pattern. When you question your first reaction instead of obeying it, you break predictability. And when predictability breaks, manipulation becomes inefficient. There is another layer here that most people overlook. Manipulation often feels uncomfortable because it targets your identity. You're not the kind of person who would say no. You've always been so generous. I thought you were stronger than that. These statements aren't about the request. They're about how you see yourself. If your identity depends on being perceived a certain way, you become vulnerable to identity pressure. The Stoics anchored identity internally, not socially. They defined themselves by principles, not by reactions from others. That internal anchor reduces emotional sway. If someone tries to attach your worth to a decision, but your worth is already stable, the hook doesn't land. You don't need to argue. You don't need to defend. You simply remain steady. Over the next habits, you'll notice a pattern. We're not teaching you to confront manipulators aggressively. We're teaching you to become structurally difficult to move. When your decisions are delayed slightly, when your explanations are minimal, when your need for approval is reduced, when your emotional state is governed, manipulation loses oxygen, and when it loses oxygen, it fades. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped being easy to steer. Habit number 1, pause before agreement. This sounds simple, almost obvious, but it is one of the most powerful anti-manipulation habits you can build. Manipulation thrives on speed. It pushes for immediate answers, immediate reassurance, immediate commitment. Can you do this right now? I just need a quick yes. It'll only take a minute. The faster you respond, the less time you have to think. And the less time you think, the more likely you are to decide emotionally. That emotional decision is the opening. Most people are conditioned to respond quickly because quick responses feel responsible. They feel helpful. They feel polite. But quick responses also eliminate evaluation. And evaluation is protection. When you build the habit of pausing before agreement, you immediately disrupt pressure. Not dramatically, not defensively, just calmly. Let me think about that. I'll get back to you. I need to check something first. These phrases create space. Space breaks urgency, and urgency is one of the most common manipulation tools. Notice how often urgency is artificial. Very few decisions truly require instant commitment, but urgency makes you feel important. It makes the request feel critical, and it makes hesitation feel selfish. When you pause, you separate feeling from fact. You ask yourself, does this actually require an immediate decision, or am I being emotionally accelerated? The Stoics practiced deliberate delay. They believed that between stimulus and action lies freedom. That freedom exists in the pause. In that pause, you can examine your motives. Are you saying yes because it aligns with your values, or because you don't want to disappoint? Are you agreeing because it's right, or because silence feels uncomfortable? That moment of reflection weakens emotional leverage. There is another psychological benefit here. When you respond instantly, every time you become predictable. Predictability creates patterns. Patterns create access points. But when you introduce pause consistently, people learn that pressure doesn't guarantee compliance. They may try again. They may increase intensity. But if your pause remains steady, the tactic becomes less effective. Pausing also protects you from identity pressure. If someone frames a request around who you are, you're always so reliable. Your immediate reaction might be to live up to that label. But in the pause, you can ask, am I agreeing to preserve an image, or because this is actually my responsibility? That distinction changes outcomes. Over time, the habit of pausing becomes automatic. You no longer feel rushed. You no longer feel cornered. You no longer feel obligated to fill silence with agreement. And something subtle shifts socially. When people realize you do not make decisions under pressure, they adjust their approach. The emotional acceleration slows, the leverage weakens, and manipulation becomes inefficient. You don't need to argue. You don't need to accuse. You simply create space, and space restores control. Habit number 2, never explain your decisions emotionally. This is where a lot of strong, intelligent people quietly lose leverage. They don't just say yes under pressure, they justify why they're saying yes or no in a way that exposes their emotional state. And once your emotions are visible in your explanation, they become usable. When someone makes a request and you decline, what most people do next is over-explain. I'm really sorry, I just have so much going on. I feel bad, but I can't. I don't want you to think I don't care. That language may sound polite, but it reveals vulnerability points. It signals guilt. It signals anxiety. It signals a need for understanding. And those signals invite negotiation. The more emotionally layered your explanation is, the more material the other person has to work with. If you say you're overwhelmed, they offer to make it easier. If you say you feel bad, they reassure you while still pushing. If you say you don't want to disappoint them, they lean into disappointment. You think you're softening the situation, but you're actually extending it. Manipulation thrives in extended emotional exchanges. The Stoics valued clarity over comfort. A decision once made did not require emotional padding. It required composure. When you respond with simple, calm statements, "I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I've decided not to," you reduce negotiation space. You're not cold. You're not hostile. You're just complete. Completeness ends leverage. Emotional explanations keep doors open. There's a deeper psychological layer here. When you explain emotionally, you're often trying to preserve your image. You want to be seen as kind, reasonable, considerate. And that desire makes you adjustable. But when your identity is internally anchored, you don't need to defend it constantly. You can say no without proving you're still a good person. You can disagree without proving you're still kind. This is crucial because manipulation often targets your self-concept. If someone can make you feel like your goodness depends on compliance, they gain influence. When your goodness is self-defined, not externally validated, that influence collapses. Another thing happens when you stop emotional explaining. Conversations shorten. Pressure cycles break faster. You don't get pulled into hour-long discussions defending a simple boundary. You state your decision. You hold it, and silence does the rest. Silence is uncomfortable for people who rely on emotional leverage. They expect expansion. They expect negotiation. When they don't get it, the tactic weakens. This doesn't mean you never give context when context is appropriate. It means you don't give context to manage someone else's emotional reaction. That distinction matters. When your explanations become factual instead of emotional, your presence changes. You appear steady, harder to move, less adjustable under pressure. And that stability makes manipulation inefficient, not because you attacked it, but because you stopped feeding it. Habit number 3, detach from approval. This is the pivot point, because most manipulation doesn't rely on force. It relies on your desire to be seen a certain way: liked, trusted, needed, respected, generous, strong. When your self-worth is even slightly tied to how others perceive you, that perception becomes leverage, and leverage invites pressure. Think about how often you've agreed to something not because you wanted to, but because you didn't want to look selfish, or because you didn't want to be labeled difficult, or because you didn't want someone thinking less of you. That's approval-based decision-making. And approval-based decision-making is easy to steer. If someone knows you want to be perceived as reliable, they frame requests around reliability. If they know you want to be seen as kind, they frame compliance as kindness. If they know you pride yourself on strength, they frame resistance as weakness. Suddenly, the decision isn't about the request. It's about protecting your image. The Stoics were almost radical in their indifference to external validation. Not because they didn't value relationships, but because they refused to outsource their self-concept. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that other people's opinions were impressions, not truths. If your internal compass is stable, someone else's interpretation doesn't destabilize you. When you detach from approval, manipulation loses its strongest tool, because now guilt doesn't hook you the same way. Flattery doesn't disarm you the same way. Subtle threats of exclusion don't scare you the same way. You stop asking, "What will they think of me?" and start asking, "Does this align with my principles?" That shift alone makes you difficult to move. There's a practical layer here. When someone pressures you and you feel that tightening in your chest, that discomfort that says, "I don't want to disappoint them," pause. That feeling is not proof that you're wrong. It's proof that you care about perception. Caring is human. Being controlled by it is optional. Detachment doesn't mean you stop valuing connection. It means connection no longer overrides clarity. You can still be kind without being compliant. You can still be generous without being exploited. You can still be strong without performing strength for applause. The moment you no longer need to be liked in every room, something shifts. Your tone becomes steadier. Your responses become shorter. Your boundaries become cleaner. People sense that they cannot sway you with praise or pressure. And when they sense that, they adjust. Not because you demanded it, but because your internal validation is no longer negotiable. Approval is powerful currency, but when you stop trading your decisions for it, manipulation becomes expensive and eventually ineffective. Habit number 4, observe patterns, not words. Manipulation often hides behind language, promises, apologies, big emotional explanations, reassurance, future plans. And if you focus only on what is said, you can be pulled into cycles that repeat endlessly. Words are flexible, patterns are not. One of the most powerful shifts you can make is this: stop evaluating people based on what they say in isolated moments, and start evaluating them based on repeated behavior over time. If someone consistently pressures you but always follows it with, "I didn't mean it like that," the apology is noise. The pattern is signal. If someone repeatedly promises change but the same dynamic keeps returning, the promise is noise. The pattern is signal. Manipulation depends on short memory. It relies on emotional reset. Something happens, there's tension, then there's explanation, reassurance, maybe even affection, and the cycle restarts. If you are evaluating moment by moment, you stay inside the cycle. If you step back and track the pattern, you step outside it. The Stoics were deeply observant. They trained themselves to see reality clearly, not through emotion, but through repetition and evidence. When you observe patterns, you reduce confusion. You stop asking, "Was that intentional?" and start asking, "Is this recurring?" That question changes everything, because manipulation rarely shows itself in one dramatic act. It reveals itself in consistency, and consistency can't hide behind charm forever. Practically, this means slowing down your conclusions. Instead of reacting to a single apology or single explanation, you take mental notes. Has this happened before? Is this behavior improving or repeating? Am I seeing change, or am I hearing promises? When you operate from pattern recognition, your decisions become grounded. You are no longer swayed by emotional highs or temporary repair attempts. You are responding to evidence, and evidence is harder to manipulate. There is also protection in this habit. When you rely on patterns, you don't need to argue about intent. You don't need to accuse anyone of manipulation directly. You simply adjust your level of trust based on repetition. If someone consistently demonstrates reliability, access increases. If someone consistently demonstrates pressure or inconsistency, access decreases. Calmly, quietly. Over time, people who rely on manipulation grow frustrated around pattern-oriented individuals, because emotional spikes don't work. Grand gestures don't reset everything. The behavior must change, not just the words. And that's expensive for someone who relies on language instead of discipline. When you become someone who sees patterns clearly, you stop being pulled by emotional storytelling. You move based on evidence, and evidence creates stability. Stability makes you difficult to steer. Habit number 5, control the information you expose. Manipulation requires data. The more someone knows about your fears, your insecurities, your ambitions, your pressure points, the easier it becomes to influence you. This doesn't mean you become secretive or paranoid. It means you become selective. Not everyone needs full access to your internal world. One of the biggest mistakes people make is oversharing too quickly. They reveal frustrations, financial pressure, relationship doubts, career anxiety, personal dreams, and they assume that vulnerability automatically builds connection. Vulnerability builds connection in the right environment. In the wrong environment, it builds leverage. If someone knows you're afraid of being alone, they can threaten withdrawal. If they know you're desperate for a promotion, they can use opportunity as bait. If they know you struggle with guilt, they can lean into moral pressure. Information becomes a tool. The Stoics practiced restraint in speech for a reason, not to be distant, but to protect clarity. When you speak less about your insecurities publicly, you reduce entry points. When you share goals selectively, you reduce external influence on them. When you keep certain pressures private, you reduce emotional hooks others can grab onto. This doesn't mean you never open up. It means you earn trust before you expand access. Trust should be built through consistent behavior over time, not assumed based on charm or proximity. There's also a practical layer here. If someone tries to steer you using something you shared, notice it. That's data. And the response is not confrontation, it's reduction. Less information, less exposure, less emotional transparency in that dynamic. Over time, you become harder to profile, harder to pressure, harder to emotionally predict, and unpredictability in this sense protects you. Because manipulation depends on knowing which button to push. When your internal landscape is not publicly mapped, those buttons are harder to find. Another benefit emerges here: emotional independence. When you stop broadcasting every internal struggle, you build internal resilience. You process more privately. You decide more independently. You are less swayed by external commentary on your vulnerabilities. And that internal strength compounds. Controlling information exposure is not about hiding. It's about pacing. It's about recognizing that access to you emotionally, psychologically, strategically is earned. When you manage that access intentionally, manipulation becomes inefficient, because the tools required to move you are no longer readily available. Now let's layer this together at a higher level. Because once you build these 5 habits, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your emotional neutrality becomes a shield, not a wall. A shield. There's a difference. A wall is defensive and rigid. A shield is steady and mobile. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you don't broadcast every fluctuation. And when you don't broadcast fluctuation, people can't calibrate pressure against it. Manipulation depends on feedback. If someone pushes and sees you tense, they push there again. If someone flatters and sees you light up, they use flattery again. If someone introduces urgency and sees you scramble, they repeat urgency. But when your visible reactions remain measured, the feedback loop weakens. The manipulative pattern starts to feel inefficient. Think about how frustrating it is to try to steer someone who doesn't spike emotionally. Not cold, not dismissive, just grounded. You introduce pressure, they pause. You introduce guilt, they stay calm. You introduce praise, they nod and move on. There's no hook, no dramatic rise or fall, just stability. Stability removes leverage. The Stoics trained themselves in this discipline daily. They practiced observing their impressions before reacting. They practiced not attaching identity to external praise or criticism. They practiced reducing emotional volatility. And that training made them extraordinarily difficult to manipulate, because they did not move quickly under emotional force. There's another psychological effect here that's important. When you remain calm under pressure, the emotional discomfort transfers. The other person begins to feel the tension they were trying to create in you. Silence becomes heavier. Pauses become longer. The urgency loses oxygen, and often without you doing anything aggressive, the tactic fades. This is not about playing power games. It's about internal governance. The more stable you become, the less reactive you are. The less reactive you are, the less influence others have over your decision-making speed. And when they can't speed you up, guilt you down, or flatter you sideways, manipulation becomes inefficient. Emotional neutrality also protects your energy. You don't spend hours replaying conversations. You don't feel pulled into defensive mental loops. You don't spiral over someone else's tone. That energy stays with you. And retained energy builds clarity. Clarity builds strength. Strength builds presence. Over time, people sense it. They may not consciously identify what changed, but they feel that you are not easily moved, not easily rushed, not easily pressured. And when someone feels that about you, they adjust their approach. Because manipulation requires traction, and emotional neutrality removes traction. Let's close this the right way. You don't become impossible to manipulate by learning clever comebacks. You don't become immune by calling everyone toxic. And you definitely don't become strong by becoming paranoid. You become difficult to manipulate by becoming disciplined. That's the difference. Manipulation only works when there's an opening, an emotional acceleration, a need for approval, a fear of conflict, a habit of over-explaining, a pattern of immediate agreement. When those openings close, the tactics lose oxygen. You don't need to fight manipulators. You need to remove the tools they rely on. When you pause before agreement, urgency weakens. When you stop explaining emotionally, guilt weakens. When you detach from approval, flattery weakens. When you observe patterns, storytelling weakens. When you control information, exposure leverage weakens. And when your emotional neutrality becomes consistent, the entire system collapses, because there's nothing left to grab onto. The Stoics didn't spend their lives trying to outmaneuver people. They focused on mastering themselves, and self-mastery creates structural protection. If your internal state isn't easily shaken, your external decisions aren't easily steered. That's real power. Not loud, not dramatic, just stable. And stability is intimidating in the quietest way. Here's what's important: this isn't about becoming closed off. It's about becoming calibrated. You can still be generous, still be kind, still be open. But now it's intentional, not automatic. Now it's chosen, not pressured. And that shift alone changes your entire presence. When people realize they can't rush you, guilt you, flatter you, or pressure you into decisions, they recalibrate. Some will respect you more, some will drift away. Both outcomes are clarity. And clarity is better than confusion disguised as connection. At the end of the day, manipulation isn't defeated with aggression. It's defeated with structure. Structure in your timing, structure in your language, structure in your exposure, structure in your emotions. And structure builds sovereignty. So remember this: you don't need to win psychological games. You need to stop being easy to steer. If this resonated, drop a comment below. I move by principle, not pressure. And if you're serious about building unshakable internal strength, make sure you're subscribed, because the strongest position in any room isn't dominance, it's composure.